Good morning. My name's Will Marion. I am the co-founder of the Positive Group. And it's great to welcome you to what is a new series of webinars from us. We've been away for a couple of months, but what we want to do in this new series called Back to Work but Better is to look at some of the key challenges from a psychological health perspective that we know are impacting on organizations, leaders, individuals at the moment, but also as we head into what feels like a new chapter around the pandemic. We've been working really closely with sort of leaders and clients across sectors, across geographies, and I think there's a number of trends that we're seeing that are impacting all businesses, all workplaces. And I suppose what we're looking to do in this series is to share those trends, give you some of our insights from speaking to multiple organizations and sectors around this. Also look at this from a psychological perspective, get some expert opinion on this. And most importantly, I think, is to look at what are the things that we can do proactively to meet some of these psychological health challenges, which are undoubtedly already impacting us, but are actually set to significantly increase. We debated this long and hard, but the topic we wanted to kick off with is a very big one. It's the concept and the topic of anxiety. I think this is the reason we've chosen this is it's something that is impacting absolutely everyone we speak to. I don't think there's an individual who isn't impacted either directly or indirectly. And it's been something that has been a hallmark throughout the pandemic, particularly around the uncertainty of it. And we actually, we did some research back in May and June, and actually the biggest things that were driving anxiety were, the health and well-being of family members. It was around social isolation, job security was a big factor, as was your physical health and your psychological health. So I think some of those, have very much remained, but I think there's also now we're hearing, and we'll be releasing more research shortly, that there's a real anxiety around some of the return to work challenges. And organizations I know are at very different phases around this. Some people, or some parts of the organization are back to work, some aren't. So I think this is a real trend that we're seeing. We've also been looking at the research around this, and we're going to share a bit of this with you shortly. But there are some really interesting research coming through now, which is showing that the aftermath of the pandemic and the impact on psychological health, which is really going to be felt, obviously across society, but certainly within the workplace, is going to be quite significant. Really significant. So I think what we're really keen to do today is to look at some of the things that we can do as businesses and as leaders around this. I think it's probably worth mentioning and reminding ourselves that from our perspective, having worked around psychological health and supporting businesses, educational institutions for many years around this, that workplace stress, workplace anxiety, burnout was considered to be hitting crisis point before we even before COVID was even part of our vocabulary. I think what we need to do now is, and business leaders need to be considering is what's coming around this, and how can that be met, particularly in a proactive way, to support the psychological health, but also to actually start to manage and flourish as businesses as much as you can in the tough times ahead. So I think one of the things we're really interested to get your thoughts on and discuss as well is the role of business within this, because it's something that was really very topical, pre-COVID, and it's something that's going to need to be very topical going forward. You'll be pleased to hear we've got a few experts today to help us unpick what is a major topic and a major area of research. I'm joined by two colleagues, Dr. Sinead Devine-French, who is she's our head of product. She leads our research team. She talks to a lot of clients across education and businesses. She's an educational psychologist. So welcome, Sinead.
Thank you.
And I've also got with me the other co-founder of Positive, Dr. Brian Marion, who is a medic, a health psychologist, and a cognitive and behavioural psychologist. So we are in good hands in order to look at some of the science and the research around this area of anxiety. Brian, let me kick off with you. I think what would be really helpful is to just think about anxiety. It's a word that we use a lot. It's something we've heard a huge amount, from everyone we talk to, but also through the media. I think it would be really helpful just to get an explanation from a psychological perspective of what we mean by anxiety.
Yeah, certainly. Good morning, everybody. Anxiety, I think, in sort of academic terms, it's looked at as being future oriented. So anxiety is about apprehension, it's about preparedness, it's about thinking about what's coming. Whereas fear is actually dealing with an imminent danger. It's present, it's very close to being present. So I think this differentiates between anxiety and fear. And the reason this is important is that, we'll come onto this more later, is that humans are capable of generating anxiety through thought and images. But once the threat circuit is activated through either anxiety or fear, it has what's called neurological primacy. This is the most powerful neurological circuit in your brain and in your body. It makes sure that you stay in the gene pool. It primes you. It hijacks your thinking, it hijacks your physiology, and it drives your behavior. And this is absolutely essential. So if you drill down a little bit, this is intended to prime you, but also make you focus on the threat. So your attentional focus is totally absorbed by the source of the threat. Depending on how anxious or fearful you feel, if you're very anxious, all your bandwidth, all your working memory, your whole ability is actually directed towards the threat. And this is really important, because if you didn't focus on the threat, you get taken out of the gene pool. So this has been wired into our systems. The problem is that it creates high levels of physiological change. So you get a thumping heart, dry mouth, sweaty palms. These physical symptoms are designed to help you fight, flee, or freeze. And they're really important, and they're natural, and they're normal. But they can also be very aversive. They can be unpleasant. And some of the symptoms of adrenaline, cortisol, and high arousal from anxiety can actually frighten us. So then we can become frightened about feeling frightened, or become distressed by the physical symptoms.
Sorry, it's just, I think one of the things that really interests us, around this is, and something that, I think we've all observed, is the different levels of, anxiety within different individuals. And I think, how people react to this. And I think, leaders in business will see this across their teams. We'll see this with different different friends, family members respond. What are your thoughts around that?
I think there's masses of data on this, that we have what's called a differential susceptibility. This means that it's rather like a normative distribution of weight or height or IQ across a population. So some people are much more anxious, and some people are relatively have little anxiety or require quite a lot to make them anxious. And I think that's very important to understand this. Like most things, it sits on a normative distribution. But I think if you have higher levels of anxiety, if you have very high levels, that's called free-floating anxiety or generalized anxiety. And you're going to be much more easily primed into a threat state than if you're at the other end of the spectrum. So this differential susceptibility is relevant. There's a genetic loading. There's also early experiences or previous experiences. And also what's happening in your life at the moment, because it's often cumulative. So if a number of things are happening, then it increases your chances of developing stress or anxiety.
Interesting. And I think one of the things that you mentioned there, and we talk a lot about, is this ability to imagine. And I think what's really interesting about the pandemic is that it's both real, but it has this imaginary element to it as well, because of its, the fact it's invisible, and it drives the imagination through the fear circuit so much. Sinead, I know you've been looking at this a lot and looking at some of the research around this. What's happened, around the pandemic, and what's changed, that's contributing to the levels of anxiety?
Good morning, everyone. Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Will, by drawing that link between real and imagined threat. So when we look at what's happening since COVID-19, so since kind of lockdown happened, is that there is a very real and present danger. So there's a real level of threat there, but also we've got the capacity to amplify and imagine and exaggerate that threat within our own minds. And I think when you look at the research, when you look at the language coming from medical professionals, from psychiatrists, from psychologists, what we are seeing is that there's a real upward trajectory in poor psychological health, which has occurred since the onset of this. And psychiatrists are kind of warning globally about this kind of tsunami of mental health problems that's going to come along on the back of the pandemic. Mm. And I think, as Brian was describing, anxiety is a very normative human response. And actually, each and every one of us will have had an anxious response to coronavirus. As psychologists, we often say that it's a bit of a perfect storm for your psychological health, because it's got this really unique profile in that it can pose a level of threat to every area of our lives. It can impact everything from health to financial stability, to our freedom to travel, to our education, absolutely every area of our life. And if you look at what has happened since March, when we went into a really strict and severe lockdown, and then over the course of that time, things have changed. So we've had a bit of a staggered reemergence from there. We've been kind of back to school, not back to school, back to work, not back to work. What's consistent over that time is the level of threat and the level of uncertainty. And threat and uncertainty, they're both like accelerants for anxiety. So they create the perfect kind of breeding ground and conditions for anxiety to really take off. And I think at a kind of very normative level, what you see is that it is having an impact on the wider general population. So the research would suggest that 1 in 2 people are saying that since March time, they have experienced an impact on their psychological health. So they have been feeling higher levels of psychological distress or anxiety. We're seeing a similar number, so over 50% of people saying that their sleep has been negatively impacted. And people are finding it difficult to focus and be productive in their work, to study and to learn. So there's kind of very normative level and way that this has impacted us. But then I think what's even more significant is to tune into the clinical levels of anxiety that we're experiencing. So we've seen a real acceleration in that. So pre-lockdown, you were looking at anxiety levels of between 9 and 11% of the population. Now that has tripled. So we're looking at 25 to 35% of people are experiencing clinical levels of anxiety or depression. So the impact is real. It's touching everybody's lives, but it is touching some people's lives much more significantly than others.
Interesting. I suppose just for the audience we're talking to today, which I think is predominantly business leaders, people with an interest in people professionals, if you like. What are the challenges that this is posing in the workplace? Sinead, I know you've been talking to a lot of our clients both in education and organisation. So what are those? How is this manifesting? What are those challenges we're seeing and hearing about in the workplace?
Well, I think one of the key challenges is figuring out a response to this. So a response that is not just reactive. So we're not waiting until this kind of tidal wave comes along, but that we're moving into a proactive space with this. So we're really starting to embrace the challenge, grab the bull by the horns and think, well, what can we do in response to this? And I think anxiety and anxiety management has to be part of our planning for the future. So designing the new norm and what that looks like for our workers, we need to build this central to what we do. And as you pointed out at the start, Will, I think anxiety, stress, burnout, these were already at the top of the boardroom agenda before COVID-19 happened. But now that this has happened, there's been an acceleration, and its importance has, it's even more important now that we tune into how we manage this. And I think one of the things that organizations need to be aware of is the fact that whilst each and every one of us are impacted in some way by this thing, some groups are hardest hit. And if you look at the research, it's suggesting that there are quite discrete groups across the population that are experiencing the psychological impact of this and feeling it more deeply. And that is people from a Black minority ethnic background, women, young people, people who have an existing physical or psychological health problem, and parents of young children, so kind of preschool children. So there are certain groups that are really feeling the toll more than others. And I think tuning into that and organizations getting in front of how they support these groups is really important. And I think the other thing I'd say for organizations is just to tune into the legacy preparation for this. It's not going to be a case of we get the vaccine, the magical vaccine, and it's going to be end of coronavirus, end of psychological health problems. Look back across history and what's happened in previous pandemics like the SARS outbreak, which was much shorter in duration, there's a significant follow-up, there's significant ramifications for long-term psychological health problems. And that goes back to what Brian was talking about earlier. So once our kind of levels of anxiety get to a certain level and we enter into this cognitive emotional fusion, we start to get ourselves stuck. And it's quite self-perpetuating, and it's also other perpetuating. So, in terms of how we ourselves are feeling and thinking, and how we're making each other feel and think. It's just preparing for the legacy of this. So it's not going to be a case of end of pandemic, end of problem.
No, absolutely. I want to come back to that point around different groups, and particularly I know we're going to pick up on young people, because I think there's a big responsibility and challenge facing business there. But I just also, I suppose, we look at, we focus on, proactive psychological health. And one of the big, motivators around this for us is actually looking at and one of the fascinating things is looking at those links between our psychological health and performance. And I think if you take anxiety as the subject here, Brian, it'd be good to get your thoughts on this. What is the it's almost like this, there's obviously there's a requirement for us to meet this challenge from a health perspective, but there's also huge benefits in terms of actually proactively addressing this from a performance perspective, from individual through to organizational performance. Can you shed some thoughts and shed some light on that for us?
Yes, I think organizations, most organizations are well aware that when you're feeling stressed, anxious, it hijacks that attention. So I think we've got a very limited bandwidth as human beings. So our working memory is quite small. It has very limited RAM, if you like. And when you're stressed or anxious above a certain quantum, you have very little bandwidth left for concentrating, memory, decision-making. And there's masses and masses of data looking at cognitive function. And when you go above a certain stress level, your cognitive function starts to become impaired. So this is a key performance indicator for most organizations. They've recruited bright, competent, capable people. But if they're really stressed and anxious, they're going to see a decrement in their cognitive function, which will relate to their performance and their ability to function.
And I think, that's obviously from an individual sort of executive function perspective. We know the huge impact it has there. You sent me an article this morning actually saying that our fear is more contagious than coronavirus. I think it's very interesting to think about the contagion element of this, and how damaging the impact of that can be on teams, and sort of team psyche, but also on relationships, because if people are stressed and anxious, the way that they interact with their colleagues is completely different.
Absolutely. So I think just to that point, contagion. We're designed as human beings. We're a very social animal. So we have two ways of picking up a threat. One is by direct communication, either visual or verbal, or from tonality, body language, facial expression. We're constantly messaging. And we have this high radar of social Wi-Fi. So social contagion or emotional contagion runs through groups very, very, very quickly. So that's one aspect, and you can see that with sort of things like mass hysteria or whatever. But it happens to all of us. We pick up how other people are feeling. The other bit of this is that on a behavioral level, when we start to get a bit stressed and wound out, we become self-focused. We reduce that bandwidth. But we actually take much less interest in our fellow man and woman. We may not listen to them, we may not be available for them, or we may become irritable and rude and start excluding people. So the way we behave when we're feeling good and happy and contented is very different to how we perform when we're feeling stressed and anxious. And that milk of human kindness, that thing that actually nourishes relationships, can start to break down, and that can have really severe implications for teamwork, for morale, for collaboration and cooperation. So this again is a key performance indicator for teams, how people are communicating.
I think that's interesting, because we had a question from someone in the audience actually, looking at, asking, how do you stay positive and how do you develop creative thinking, at a time like this. And I think that's really, we get so many discussions with organizations where there's sometimes not an alignment around the sort of the health factor, and what they're looking to achieve in terms of performance. There's sometimes a sense that we need to focus on health and well-being, but actually, well, now's the time. Actually, we need to actually push forward on return to growth and performance and business metrics. And I think one of the really interesting things around, those questions around mindset, how do you create, more adaptable teams, more collaborative teams? How do you see the opportunities? How do you create more openness to experience? Those are all skills, often coined future skills, around that that cannot be achieved unless you have good psychological health. Because if you're in that threat state, you can't actually think in those ways. And I think there's obviously a big interest and requirement around the health element, but I think what's exciting is aligning that to creating the right mindset and the right culture to actually to start to perform in the best way possible, see different opportunities, drive your business forward as much as you can is a really exciting and interesting one, and putting those together can make a big difference. Sinead, I know you have done a lot of work around this with some of our clients.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's a really good question about the creativity, because what we're seeing now is a real demand for this in the workforce. Things are changing at such a pace. People are thinking about redesigning the future. And so actually creativity has really risen to the fore as a desirable skill within the workforce. And I think your point, Will, about the link between health and the skills is a really, really crucial one. Seeing them as exclusive is dangerous. Seeing them as two sides of the same coin, I think, is really helpful for organizations. I think we have been working for a number of years on the future skills agenda. So creativity, innovation, adaptability, kind of collaborative working, communication skills, all these things that we know we need in the workforce. But in reality, when you dig below those skill set, it's all about psychological well-being. So if I'm in a high stress, high pressure, the kind of toxic levels of stress and anxiety and worry going on, it's very hard for me to be creative in those conditions. So actually what we've been working with organizations to do is to create the right environment in which those skill sets can rise to the fore. And I think, today we've been talking about the kind of challenge that we have with psychological health and how that could impact performance. But what we know is actually there's a core set of psychological skills that are all learnable, that we have a really good evidence base behind them, that we can work with people to develop. And once you get those and you look after your well-being, those other skills sit on top of that. So your ability to think about things dynamically and creatively, they come on board and online once that first piece is right. So I think what's exciting is working with organizations to understand that, but also to understand the key levers that enable this to kind of cascade across the workforce. And what we know is that leadership, line managers, these guys have serious influence over psychological well-being across the organization. So actually, if you can build capability in those leaders, it can have a huge impact on the workforce.
Really. If it's role modeled, if those behaviors are seen, there's a lot being written about, your to-be list and as a leader is becoming more important than your to-do list. I think that's some fascinating things to look at around that. I just aware of time. I think one thing I just want to talk about as well is those groups you mentioned, Sinead. We do a lot of work with schools over the last 6 or 7 months, also the NHS, and we know from our conversations with those institutions that the impact has been huge, but the impact on young professionals is going to be absolutely massive. And what this means for young teachers, young doctors, young professionals generally, young people generally is stark. And I think, we did some research in May, June, that actually looked at, actually the results were only 4.5% of 18 to 25-year-olds reported high well-being versus 38% 46 to 65-year-olds. I think this generational divide in the impact is so important to the response to it. I know the ONS came out very recently with similar data, looking at the impact was much greater between 16 to 39-year-olds. So, Sinead, I know you've obviously got a lot of experience working with young people. You've been looking at a lot of this research. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's such an important topic to get on the agenda. I think, first of all, understanding that actually this group historically are vulnerable. So if you look at what's going on with the adolescent and young adult mind between the ages of about kind of 11, 12, 13, the onset of adolescence, right through to 24, 25, there's a huge amount of change and rewiring and resculpting going on in the kind of young mind. And there's a whole influx of hormones, and there's lots of things that are happening. And this group are more vulnerable to psychological health problems. So if you look at adult psychological health problems, you can trace the onset of 75% of those prior to the age of 25, and the onset of 50% of adult mental health problems to prior to the age of 15. This period is a really important period for us to get the conditions for good psychological well-being right in, because they are a more vulnerable group. But then secondly, I think in the workplace, what we really need to do is to understand their perspective at the minute. So if you are a grad, if you are new to role, you've just joined an organization, I think if leaders and managers can understand the perspective of those young people. And I think there's a couple of things that put them at risk. There's a social side to things, and then there's a confidence, competence, skill development side to things. So on the social side, many young people have maybe moved away and relocated for their job to a new area where they don't have a social support network. And for them, being in the office is really, really important to feel connected to others. And we've heard from the organizations that we're working with that young people are really struggling to work from home. They're often in maybe overcrowded flat shares. They're struggling to get space to work. So there's a kind of social side of things, but also when you kind of start out in your career, the ability to learn from mentors and role models and to build your skill set is so important. And actually, if you're not seeing people day to day, you're not building up your social capital, your social skills, that can have a huge impact on your own confidence. And what we know is that psychological health problems are rising faster in this group since kind of COVID came along than any other group. So organizations do need to get this on the agenda. It's a really, really important, topic.
Brian, very quickly, and any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, I think as this is a perfect storm and a perfect storm. I mean, I think that these young people are rarely vulnerable. We know that most psychological problems incubate. What we should be doing is moving upstream to educate people on very evidence-based techniques that could really mitigate risk. And as a society, we don't tend to do that. We tend to wait for people to become ill, and then we try and intervene. And the services aren't actually up to speed at the moment because they're not funded. I think we need to move upstream. We need to give these people tools and techniques that can help them manage some of the ups and downs they're experiencing.
Absolutely. And I think, just to finish on this, your point around leadership, Sinead, is really interesting. And also the ability to connect with those groups is so key. And we see this in all of our research. Those that are able to have better open and honest interactions with their leaders have better psychological health. We saw this around actually levels of optimism from our data in May and June. If you're able to connect with, and particularly on a regular basis at the moment, connect with your leaders or your managers, it has such an impact because they hold so much control around perceived certainty and uncertainty at the moment. And I think, it's what's really interesting is that there's been this sort of debate around sort of generational divides and perspectives. And I think actually, creating that emotional literacy, that understanding, that ability to stand in the shoes of that younger generation by leaders is going to be, is going to be a key skill in terms of making a major impact on psychological health, but also performance. We need to move on, because I'm very keen we spend some time looking at what we can be doing around this. And Sinead, I'm going to come to you because, we Positive, we are obviously looking at how you can take a proactive, solution-focused approach to psychological health to build the psychological skills in individuals, leaders, organizations that will enable us to meet some of these challenges. We have got an approach around that's based in a lot of evidence. I think what would be useful is to just think about some of those solutions and approaches to share with the audience today around how you might how you could be thinking about this and what solutions we can actually tangibly apply. Sinead, over to you.
Yeah, brilliant. So I think this part's really important. This part's kind of about the solutions. And I think one of the important things to say, first off, is not to feel overwhelmed by the fact that we are having these challenges and there has been this increase in psychological health problems. What we need to do is to actually take action. So if we can be proactive about this, that's the first step. And then I think what we would advocate at Positive that you do is to do the right things. So be evidence-based in the things that you're doing, and look at the science, be expert-led. But then a really crucial ingredient is to know and understand your own people and your own workforce and team. So if you can understand what's going on for them, you can really start to kind of tailor what you do in response to that. And I'm going to try and multitask for a second while I share a slide, which is always tricky. And essentially at Positive, we've pulled together these 4 steps. If I can go on to the next one. We've pulled together these 4 steps. Oh, it's going to play me up now, Will. Let's see. There we go. Hold on, close your eyes for a second, folks. There we go. Okay. So these 4 steps are essentially a framework that we've pulled together for good psychological health across an organization. We've kind of tailored this specifically to COVID-19 and those challenges, but actually this works regardless. This is an evidence-based approach to good psychological well-being, even in the absence of COVID-19. But the first step really is all about building awareness. So this is about creating a common language. This is about psychological education, normalizing the psychological impact of things like COVID-19 and getting it on the agenda. So at Positive, we have a series of talks, some that are specific to the challenges of COVID-19 and some that are specific to other workplace kind of things that are on the agenda and priorities for psychological health. But Brian, can you maybe explain a little bit about psychological education and how powerful it can be?
Well, I think this is the really good news, is that psychological education is now an evidence-based approach. If you explain to people a bit more how their brain works and about how their psychology works and a bit more about being human, and I think understanding the risk factors and the protective factors is absolutely key. If we understand what we might be doing that could be sort of aggravating or compounding the problem, and we can mitigate that. But if we can then also think about the things that are going to nourish our spirit and help us cope. And I think psychological education, and there's very good data from the school environment, that giving social and emotional literacy to young people is highly protective. We need to bring this into the workplace. We need to actually build psychological education and build psychologically informed environments. And I think that's what building awareness could do.
And I think what's really nice about that is there's evidence to say that that in and of itself can have a really positive impact in organizations. So that's kind of what we would advocate. Step one is about getting it on the agenda, sharing information that is helpful, and really tuning people into the things at the individual and group level that we can do that are protective. I think once you've got that foundation, the next thing we would advocate is understanding and knowing the challenges that are specific to your people. So using your own kind of data. And at Positive, we've got Positive Insights. This is a series of tools and surveys which we can use to gauge the psychological well-being of your people and to kind of repeat that over time. So you can see that as the challenges shift over the face of COVID-19, you're keeping your finger on the pulse of what's going on for your people. And Will, this is something that has been really useful to organizations since COVID-19 came along.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I think, and it's something we use at Positive on a regular basis. It's extremely useful to know how people are feeling, and actually, gives you the perspective of the organisation, or of everyone in the organisation. So yeah, I think being able to have your finger on the pulse, particularly at a time when actually you're missing quite a lot from the live interaction with your team, is key. And we know that the psychological health challenges, the levels of uncertainty are really high, and everyone's situation and scenario is so different. So I think from that perspective, it's extremely useful. And also, just quickly on that, is just also to look at it around the different factors. So looking at individual factors, but also then looking at environmental factors, and possibly what we often look into leadership factors. So it can provide you with the levers that can drive the greatest impact and change within the business.
Absolutely. And it means that you're taking the right action for your people. And that's what I really like about it. So it's kind of not kind of just very generic. It's about what's right for you. And I think the next step that we have then is, so once you've raised awareness, once you know what's happening, it's about building up and strengthening your community and your people. So making sure that people have access to knowledge, tools, techniques, ways of working that will enable them to be proactive about their well-being. So enable them to keep this on the agenda and support each other to make this a priority. And at Positive, we've developed Positive Now as a way of doing this. So this is our kind of digital learning offering, so people can do it in their own time. But again, it can go to scale across the organization, so everyone can have access to this toolkit of resources that enables them to kind of keep building their skill set in this area. And Will, this is something that can be quite useful for organizations to link to their kind of CPD.
Yeah, I think we see most success around online is obviously a tricky place to drive engagement, and even drive awareness around. So I think we see success around this where it's actually where well-being and psychological health are placed high up in the objectives of what an organization is looking to achieve. And if there's often pathways developed around your psychological health where approaches like this can really up the understanding, the knowledge, the skills, and I think really importantly the common language. I mean, I think if you have whole organizations or teams using and applying the same tools and concepts, and understanding that science, it can have a really proactive and positive impact on health, mindset, performance, etc.
And the final step then that we have, kind of once we've laid those foundations, is to think about the levers that kind of give a kind of optimal bang for buck. And this is building capability in your leadership team. So line managers, the people that interact with people and can really influence people's well-being. So I think building a psychological skill set in these people, and this is the point that we touched on earlier in the webinar, building the skills in these people so that they can first of all look after their own well-being, and then act and behave and engage with other people in ways that support that to cascade across the organization. And that's what our Positive Leaders program aims to do. So it aims to take this kind of very definitive set of skills that we know are evidence-based to support good well-being and build and develop them. And as I said earlier, the nice thing is that they can always be things that we can get better at doing. So that's brilliant. And Brian, anything that you would say about this leadership group and how important this is?
I think it's key. I think the influencers, I think in the organizations that we've worked with, when the leaders actually buy into this, they walk the talk, they value it, they actually want it to get into the DNA of the organization to shift the culture. I think it's absolutely pivotal. And when the leaders do that, I think it starts to cascade down into the organization. And I think that's links to cultural display rules and cultural norms. People who are in the organization look to the leadership for what is rewarded, what is good, what is accepted. And if the leadership are modeling this behavior, I think its impact is absolutely vast.
Yeah.
And Will, just as I hand back to you, what about leaders themselves? This is a bit of a tough time for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, you know, looking after yourself first is one of the biggest change agents, really, around how you're going to impact on others. You cannot support psychological health and well-being of teams if you yourself are stressed and burnt out or wound out. So I think that's it's absolutely vital. I think also I think leaders often underestimate the impact that they have on those around them. And I think particularly in times of uncertainty and economic uncertainty and job uncertainty, which we're starting to see as a rationale for the anxiety going up, it's absolutely vital that that leaders are prioritizing themselves, but also role modeling these behaviors if they want to see them applied in their teams. Because I think actually if they're not, and you have invested in supporting teams and individuals, and then it's not role modeled by the leaders, you can create a bigger problem than you started with. So yeah, I think that leadership piece, as all of the evidence, all of the research, all of our research shows, is huge. And I think there's the one piece of data that came out of our research from May, June, which I think was fascinating, was around the link between leadership, connection, and optimism at the moment. It was 20% higher in those that connected with their leaders on a daily basis. So I think that's where we mustn't underestimate the role of leaders in that. Well, I'm just aware we're coming up to time. I'd be great to just to think about some of the conversations that we've had, partly as a group and an organisation, but also with our clients, because I think there is some real optimism, certainly within Positive, around what can be done around this. We certainly, there are certainly challenges ahead. I think if you read too many of the papers which Sinead and Brian send around, you can lose some of that quite quickly. And if you watch the media, you can also be damaging around that. But I think what we've seen working with clients is there are things that you can do that can make a big impact. And Sinead, I might hand back to you, because I know you've got some insight into that.
Yeah, I think what's really important to do during times like this, always important, but specifically during times like this, is to retain a sense of hope and optimism, and to really tune into the things that we're doing well and the things that are helpful. And we've done quite a bit of work in education over the last 6 months, and the data that we have coming out of that, in terms of young people's well-being, one of the most protective things that emerged was how supportive and understanding they thought their teacher was. So if they thought their teacher cared about them, cared about their exam results and their future life course, and actively tried to understand their unique challenges at this time, that was really protective for how they reported their well-being to be. And I think that's lovely. It's that kind of relationship, care, and time that their teacher was able able to give them that really help them. And I think particularly this week has been such a difficult week for young people. And I think where they can understand that teachers, adults, parents, the future kind of workforce has their back, I think that's really important. Brian, I don't know if you would add to that.
I just mentioned something that you and I have discussed a lot, which is more in the corporate sector, which I think comes back to this concept that it's the understanding the impact of being a human being. And one of the key features, which I think you've just touched on with the teacher relationship, is that social cohesion, that social connection is so protective. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of papers on the positive impact of social support. And I just mentioned a piece of work that we did through our Positive Insights team. They worked with a professional services firm. They got over 100,000 data points from all sorts of areas of the business. They looked at correlations. They then did a factor analysis, and 3 factors came out as being highly predictive of psychological well-being, performance, and reduced attrition. And those factors were if the line manager showed an interest in the person, they respected them and cared about them as a human being. The second thing was whether they were interested in their professional development, so they mentored them. And the third factor was that they had regular, open, honest, authentic conversations. If those 3 factors were met, the impact on people was that they often worked harder, but they perceived less stress. They performed better, they enjoyed their work, and they spoke about the organization in a much more positive way. So I think there are things that you can do at an individual level, a team level, an organizational level, and at a leadership level. And I think if you pull all those levers, you can make a significant impact.
Well, just before you close, a few people have asked if the recording will be available afterwards, and it will be. So just to say that.
No problem. Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. And I think, thank you for that comment, Sinead. I think it's a great metaphor, isn't it, to be, if we can all be better teachers, think about the teachers we had that we remember well. That in and of itself can have a huge impact. This is, this is not rocket science. It's about, as you say, Brian, being more human. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. As you say, there'll be a recording going around. Do get in touch with us if you'd like to talk to us further about what we do and how we might be able to support you. And we'll also be sharing details of the future webinars within this series. But thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.